He thought he knew his company. He thought the luxury cruise ship bearing his name was still delivering unforgettable experiences. But just minutes after stepping on board, disguised as a regular guest, he heard something that stopped him cold. What he uncovered over the next 48 hours would expose lies, break trust, and force him to face a horrifying truth. The empire he built was rotting from within. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Graham Carter stood at the stern of the Elysian Voyager, a ship he had once dreamed into existence. The ocean stretched before him in glistening waves, but his thoughts churned darker than the water below. He wasn't Graham Carter tonight. Clad in cargo shorts, a faded Rolling Stones t-shirt, and a baseball cap tugged low, he was Greg Lawson, an ordinary passenger, invisible in the blur of vacationers sipping overpriced cocktails and taking selfies under a lavender sky. 10 years ago, Graham had bought a failing cruise line and transformed it into Elysian Fleet International, a luxury experience with 14 ships on the seas and a promise etched into every brochure, where elegance meets care. But that promise had eroded. Complaints had begun to multiply: slow service, unclean rooms, staff fatigue. Yet, every report from senior leadership said the same thing: everything is under control. His gut disagreed. The illusion cracked wide open just 15 minutes after boarding. He stood in line at the poolside bar when he heard it. "This is the worst cruise I've ever been on," a woman in a wide-brimmed hat hissed, stirring her drink with agitated fingers. "We waited 45 minutes for a table last night, and the steak was cold." Her friend leaned in. "And the room? Don't get me started. Our sheets were stained. I called housekeeping twice and no one came." Graham's hand froze halfway to his drink. The words hit like ice water. He had expected some minor complaints, but this was systemic failure. He turned slightly. 2 elderly women, mid-60s maybe, sat on the poolside loungers, clearly affluent, clearly disappointed. Then, as if the universe was doubling down, a third scene unfolded nearby. A frail man in his 70s asking for an extra blanket was sharply dismissed by a staff member who rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath, "Then maybe don't cruise in January." Graham stood motionless. His instinct screamed to intervene, to correct, but he forced himself to remain Greg Lawson, the invisible man. That sting of shame, that urge to defend his creation, that was why he had to keep watching. Later that night, while pretending to read by the observation deck, his phone buzzed. "If you care about this ship, come see B-Deck Staff Corridor tonight, 11:15 p.m. Come alone." Anonymous. His breath caught. No number, no name, just a quiet threat, or a cry for help. Graham was no stranger to navigating high-stakes meetings or billion-dollar deals, but this felt different. This felt personal. He looked out toward the black water stretching endlessly ahead. Somewhere below, deep in the heart of the ship, something had rotted. The question was, how deep? And why had no one told him? He made a decision. At 11:12 p.m., Greg Lawson disappeared down the emergency stairwell headed for B-Deck. What he would find there could change everything. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly as Graham descended the metal stairwell to B-Deck. The hum of engines grew louder, echoing through the narrow hallway lined with industrial gray walls and exposed pipes. This was no guest area. This was the skeletal spine of the Elysian Voyager, and it reeked of fatigue and forgotten promises. He checked his watch. 11:14 p.m. At the end of the corridor, a figure stepped out from the shadows. A young woman in a janitor's uniform, her name tag crooked and half-faded. Mia Delgado. Her eyes darted left, then back at him. "You're late," she said flatly. "I'm here, aren't I?" Graham replied, still wearing the voice of Greg Lawson. Mia didn't smile. You said you were just a passenger, but passengers don't linger by staff halls, and they don't ask the kind of questions you asked Jake at dinner last night. Graham froze. She knew. I don't care who you are, Mia continued, but if you're really trying to help, come with me. He followed her through a side door into a narrow passage that branched into a series of rooms, linen closets, storage spaces, and at the very end, a makeshift break area. Inside, 3 other crew members sat around a plastic table, the kind you'd find in a forgotten warehouse. The air was thick with stale coffee and unspoken stress. "This is Winston," Mia said, pointing to a broad-shouldered man in a stained chef's apron. "Kitchen staff, 17-hour days, 5 days straight. That's not a typo." Winston gave a tired nod, but didn't rise. "No fresh produce in 2 weeks," he said. "They changed vendors again. The cheap ones, frozen, processed junk. Doesn't matter what I cook, it tastes like regret." A chuckle passed through the room. Not amusement. Bitterness. "Teresa was supposed to be here too," Mia added. "Housekeeping, 20-year vet, but she slipped and tore a ligament 3 days ago. Wet stairs, no maintenance, no paperwork filed. They moved her to a supply closet to keep her out of sight." "Why didn't anyone report it?" Graham asked. Winston laughed, dry and sharp. "To who? Hotel director? He's the one who cut the budget for equipment checks in the first place." One of the crew, a lanky man in maintenance coveralls named Dan, stood and walked to a locked cabinet. He retrieved a clipboard thick with paper. "This is what they won't show you," he said, handing it over. Graham skimmed the pages. Logged injuries, malfunction reports, ignored requests for replacements. Some entries were underlined in red. Escalated, denied, escalated again. No response. Graham's stomach twisted. This wasn't a breakdown. It was negligence woven into the routine. Mia stepped forward again. "You want to know what broke the spirit of this ship? It wasn't one big thing. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. Every time we spoke up and were ignored, it chipped away at us." He looked at her. Really looked. At the way her uniform was fraying at the collar, at the bruises beneath her eyes from sleep deprivation. She couldn't have been more than 27, but she carried herself like someone twice her age. Then she added something that pierced deeper than any complaint yet. "You know what scares us the most? Not that no one's listening, but that no one wants to." For the first time since he boarded, Graham Carter felt something he hadn't in years. Shame. Not the shallow kind that comes from PR disasters or quarterly dips. Real shame. The kind that lives in the pit of your chest when you realize your silence has enabled suffering. "I want to," he said finally. Mia narrowed her eyes. "Then prove it. Spend 1 day in our shoes." He didn't flinch. "Tomorrow, I'll be on staff roster." Dan raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that, Greg?" "I'm sure," Graham replied. Outside, the engines roared softly beneath their feet. Somewhere above, champagne was being poured, and string quartets played for guests in tuxedos. But down here, beneath the surface, was where the truth lived, and Graham Carter had just stepped into it. By 6 a.m., Graham was dressed in an ill-fitting khaki uniform labeled Operations Support. No one batted an eye. Down here, fresh faces appeared and disappeared too often to remember. His first stop was the crew cafeteria, a windowless chamber with flickering lights, mismatched chairs, and a smell somewhere between burnt toast and despair. He grabbed a tray and got in line. The food was exactly what Winston had described: dry eggs, hard toast, watery coffee. Across the table, a young woman with a tired ponytail slumped forward. Name tag, Mia Delgado. She looked up briefly, gave a nod, then returned to nursing her cup of bitterness. 3 hours of sleep, she muttered. I swear, if I get another passive-aggressive comment from a guest about my energy, I might throw someone off the side. Across from her sat another crew member, stocky, older, with a patch on his sleeve. Dan Vargas, maintenance. He gave a tired smirk. Just smile, Mia. Smile and apologize for everything, even if it's the air being too humid. That's what they train us to do. Graham ate in silence, observing. Every conversation was laced with a common thread: exhaustion, helplessness, and a growing resentment toward the leadership that was never seen but always felt. The contrast was jarring. Above deck, guests were already queuing for massages and mimosa brunch. Below, the people making that illusion possible were barely holding on. By mid-morning, he was reassigned to guest services, a department long praised in shareholder meetings for its unmatched response efficiency. What he witnessed was anything but. A winding line of frustrated passengers stretched from the counter to the elevators. At the center of it all was Chris, the guest relations associate he'd seen the day before. His face was composed, polite, but his fingers trembled as he typed. A woman in a floral dress stood firm at the front. 3 days. I've been calling about that plumbing issue for 3 days. We're on our anniversary cruise, and I can't even take a shower without hearing metal clanking in the walls. Chris offered a strained smile. I completely understand, ma'am. I've escalated this twice already. I promise I'll speak to maintenance again. You said that yesterday, she snapped. Chris didn't argue. He simply took a breath and nodded. I'm truly sorry. As she walked off, fuming, Graham stepped up. Rough morning? He asked. Chris gave a dry laugh. It's always like this. We're told to prioritize what they call Tier 1 disruptions: medical, safety, anything viral-worthy. The rest, backlogged. And guests think we don't care, but we do. We just don't have any power to fix anything. Graham nodded slowly. Do you report it? All the time. The reports vanish somewhere above Deck 7, never to be seen again. He moved on, but the weight of that encounter clung to him. Every department, every voice, same story, different uniform. Just after lunch, the unexpected happened. Graham was heading back from a linen run when he saw an elderly man, clearly a guest, struggling to wheel his wife's mobility scooter toward the elevator. The couple was quiet, determined. The scooter caught a snag on the carpet seam and tipped. The woman gasped as it jerked forward. Instinct took over. Graham rushed in, steadying the device before it fell completely. You all right? He asked. The man gave a breathless nod. Thanks. Staff usually don't notice. Before Graham could reply, a sharp voice cut through the hallway. What the hell is going on here? It was Avery, one of the mid-level managers. Sharp suit, sharper tone. He looked at Graham with suspicion. This is your corridor, right? Then why are guests struggling with equipment while you're standing around chatting? Graham's mouth tensed. I just helped them. That's not your job. Get back to your post. The old man blinked. Excuse me, he just saved my wife from falling. But Avery ignored him. Staff aren't to engage unless requested. Graham stared at him, the restraint visible in his jaw. Understood, sir. As the manager stormed off, the older man leaned in. He doesn't know who you are, does he? Graham smiled faintly. Let's keep it that way. Back in the supply corridor, he found Mia reorganizing linens. He told her about the elevator incident. She shook her head. Avery's not the worst, just the loudest. He yells a lot, but he's just a puppet. The real mess is higher up. Then she looked at him carefully. Something's shifting, though. Everyone's on edge. They know someone's watching. They don't know it's you. He hesitated. Do you think it would make a difference if they did? Mia folded a blanket with precision. Not if you just leave after watching. He didn't respond. But deep down, he knew she was right. Later that evening, as he walked past the upper deck cocktail lounge, now back in guest attire for appearances, he spotted one of the women from the poolside bar on day 1, the one who had said it was the worst cruise she'd ever taken. She was sitting alone now, looking out at the sea. Her drink was untouched. As Graham passed, she looked at him briefly. Nice night, she said. He paused. Could be better. She smiled wryly. That's been the theme. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the ocean breathe. Somewhere behind them, champagne was poured again. And somewhere below, Winston was preparing dinner with defrosted seafood he hadn't ordered. Graham tightened his hands around the railing. Tomorrow, he would stop watching. Tomorrow, he would act. The call came at 3:26 a.m. A blaring tone ripped through the emergency comms channel, waking every on-duty staffer across engineering and support. Alert, HVAC malfunction on subdeck C4. Technician dispatched. All non-essential staff, stay clear. Graham was already dressed. He wasn't sure if it was instinct, habit, or something deeper, but within 60 seconds he was moving through the staff corridors toward the maintenance stairwell. When he arrived at subdeck C4, the heat hit first. A blast of humid, metallic air that clung to skin and clothes like a second layer. 2 crew members were already present, a young tech with trembling hands trying to reset a control panel, and beside him, crumpled on the ground, was Jonas, one of the veteran engineering staff. Face pale, soaked in sweat, he clutched his left shoulder, body curled as if trying to disappear. He collapsed mid-diagnostics, the young tech said, voice panicked. I told him we needed 2 people on this. Ventilation resets can overload if you don't cycle it right, but he said we were short tonight and didn't want delays logged. Graham knelt down. Jonas, can you hear me? A groan. Then, faintly, they cut 4 positions last week. I've been covering 16-hour rotations. Thought I could make it through 1 more shift. The med team arrived 5 minutes later. Jonas was conscious but barely coherent as they lifted him onto the gurney. As he was wheeled away, he reached for Graham's arm. I gave this ship my youth, he rasped. It gave me burnout. The words stayed with Graham long after the hallway had cleared and the emergency lights had faded back to green. He leaned against the wall, the hum of the ship's broken circulatory system vibrating faintly beneath his spine. By 7:00 a.m., Jonas was stable, sedated in the crew infirmary. At 7:15, Graham walked into the security office. I need surveillance footage, he said. The technician, a crewman in his late 40s, with a quiet demeanor, looked up. You got authorization? Graham pulled off his cap. I am the authorization. A few seconds of stunned silence. Then the man stood, no further questions asked. Together, they reviewed footage from the past 72 hours. Graham's eyes were fixed. He watched Jonas dragging toolkits twice his weight. He watched managers skipping mandatory safety briefings. He saw staff slipping in water-soaked corridors where maintenance requests had been flagged and closed without resolution. But what broke him wasn't the silent suffering. It was what came next. At 11 p.m. the previous night, a high-ranking officer, Laird, assistant operations manager, met with Avery and the hotel director, Hoon. The audio was grainy, but the meaning clear. We need to clean up the numbers before port inspection. Strip low-priority complaints from the system. Massage the logs. And staff injuries? Log is fatigue. Don't start anything that'll bring HR audits on board. Graham sat back in his chair, hands clenched into fists. They weren't just ignoring problems. They were orchestrating a cover-up, and no one had told him. He left the surveillance room with a purpose in his stride and fire in his chest. By 9:00 a.m., he had requested an emergency leadership meeting to be held in Conference Room 1, reserved typically for corporate VIPs or investor presentations. Today, it would host something else entirely. At 9:45 a.m., the room filled slowly. Hyun, still smug and oblivious. Avery, stiff-backed with arms crossed. Laird, eyes darting. A few department heads looked confused, others pale. Graham didn't sit. He stood at the head of the long, polished table, his hands planted firmly, gaze unflinching. My name is Graham Carter, he began. I founded this fleet 10 years ago. I built it from a bankrupt hulk into a world-class cruise line because I believed people still deserved to feel wonder, comfort, and dignity at sea. He paused, letting the silence anchor every eye on him. For the past 3 days, I've been living among your crew. eating in the staff cafeteria, working in laundry halls, running maintenance checks, listening. Several faces blanched. Hun looked stunned. Avery shifted uncomfortably. "What I've seen has been disgraceful," Graham continued. "Guests furious, crew exhausted, rooms unsafe, food substandard, and a management culture that values spreadsheets over human beings." He gestured to a monitor behind him. Security footage played. The scene with Jonas collapsing, the ignored reports, the falsified logs, then the recording of the late-night meeting. The room stiffened. Haywan tried to interject. "Sir, with all due respect," Graham cut him off. "Don't. Not one excuse. You manipulated data. You put people in danger. You created a system designed to hide failure." Laird dropped his gaze. Then Graham stepped forward, his voice colder. "You told yourselves you were protecting the brand. But I am the brand, and you've betrayed everything it stands for." He turned to the door and opened it. Two security staff stepped inside. "Hyun, Laird, Avery, you're relieved of your duties effective immediately. Pack your things. You'll be escorted off at the next port." He didn't wait for rebuttals. The shock was total. One of the department heads, Carmen, from housekeeping, put her hand to her mouth in disbelief. Another, Winston, who had been summoned quietly, stood in the back, nodding once firmly. Graham looked at the rest of the room. "This isn't over, but the cover-up is. Starting now, we rebuild." The managers filed out slowly, dazed. Winston stayed behind. "You actually did it," he said quietly. Graham met his eyes. "Not yet, but I've started." Outside the conference room, the ship moved quietly through open waters. But on board, a storm had finally broken, and for the first time in a long while, someone at the helm was wide awake. The silence in the crew meeting room was suffocating. Word had spread fast, faster than the Pacific breeze rushing across the upper decks. Everyone knew by now. Graham Carter wasn't Greg Lawson. He wasn't just another face in the crowd, or a mystery hire from corporate. He was the man who signed the paychecks, who built the Elysian Voyager from rusted steel and broken promises. And now he stood before them. No disguise, no cap, no faded t-shirt. Just a plain slate blue polo, slacks, and the unmistakable weight of truth in his expression. Dozens of department heads, shift managers, and senior crew sat rigid in their chairs, some avoiding eye contact, others staring outright with disbelief, fear, or dawning hope. Graham didn't use a microphone. He didn't need one. "I built this company on a simple idea," he began, voice steady. "That people, guests and employees alike, deserve respect. That a cruise ship isn't just a vessel for profit, but a floating community where care is constant." He let that settle. "In the last 72 hours, I've seen a very different reality. I've cleaned cabins so rushed they were barely safe. I've witnessed injuries ignored, guests neglected, and a culture of silence that favors numbers over names." One man, Thomas, the food and beverage director, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "With all due respect," Thomas began, his voice low but defensive, "the cruise industry is under enormous strain. Fuel prices, staffing shortages, supply chain failures. It's not as simple as it once was." Graham turned to him slowly. "I'm aware of the industry's challenges. I read the same market forecasts you do. But this isn't about global pressure. It's about this ship. This leadership." He stepped closer to the table. "You've cut staff without considering the fallout. You've rerouted guest complaints into black holes of bureaucracy. You've turned this crew into ghosts, overworked, unheard, and replaceable." He turned his attention to Carmen, the housekeeping lead, a woman in her 40s who had been watching quietly, lips pressed tight. "Carmen," he said gently, "why does it take 3 calls to get a stained sheet replaced?" She looked up slowly. Because requests are deprioritized. My team's down 6 people. We ask for more hands, but we're told there's no budget. Who denies those requests? The room paused. Carmen hesitated. Then she glanced at the empty chair where Hune, the hotel director, used to sit. Graham nodded, noted. He turned to the group again. From today forward, guest issues are non-negotiable. I'm creating a resolution team. 5 hand-picked crew members from various departments reporting directly to me. Escalations will no longer be ignored. A few eyes widened. Whispers rippled at the edges of the room. Then he addressed the room's other unspoken truth. Housekeeping isn't the only one drowning. Engineering is dangerously stretched. Food prep staff are working with subpar supplies, and yet you all continued to report that things were fine. That's not miscommunication, that's betrayal. Graham's tone didn't rise, but it hardened. Let me be clear. Corporate budgeting guidelines do not excuse unsafe conditions. A competent leader finds solutions, not shortcuts. So, here's what's going to happen. He held up a folder and laid it on the table. First, proper staffing levels are being reinstated immediately. I've already cleared emergency budget reallocations. Second, department heads will be personally accountable for crew well-being, scheduling, support, and escalation. Third, every complaint logged will be reviewed by our new oversight team, internally audited and tracked. He scanned the room. If any of you feel unable or unwilling to operate under these new standards, speak now. No judgment, but I will replace you. No one spoke. A few glanced at the floor. 1 or 2 looked quietly relieved. Graham didn't expect confessions. He expected compliance and change. He closed the folder and stepped back. You are not babysitters of a failing system. You are stewards of a vision. And it's time we returned to it. As the managers filed out, Graham lingered behind, standing at the center of the now empty room. The silence felt different this time, less like suffocation, more like stillness before motion. Later that day, he walked the ship with intent. Not as a spy, not as a guest, but as himself. He stopped by the guest services desk. Chris stood behind it again, this time with an extra staffer beside him. The line was shorter, the tension lighter. Chris looked up and blinked. You're really him, he said. Graham Carter. I am, Graham replied, and I meant what I said. Things are going to change. Chris studied him a moment, then offered a nod, not in submission but in cautious belief. From there, Graham visited the dining hall, where Jake was working table 11, looking no less tired but visibly more focused. When Jake recognized him, he went pale. You're... Yes, Graham said, and I owe you an apology. You shouldn't have to work under those conditions, Jake stammered, caught between embarrassment and awe. I was just doing what I could. It was enough, Graham said. But you won't have to do it alone anymore. Finally, just past sunset, he climbed down to the crew quarters. Outside the laundry station on a metal bench sat Teresa, her leg wrapped in a support brace, a cooling pad on her knee. You look different, she said as he approached, raising an eyebrow. I do. You're him. I am. She studied him for a long moment, then looked away. I've heard a lot of promises from people in suits. I don't just make promises, he replied quietly. I follow through. A pause, then, softly, we'll see. As Graham walked away, the ship rolled gently underfoot. Steady, calm. But inside him, something had shifted permanently. This wasn't a company rescue mission anymore. It was a reclamation, a vision, of dignity, of everything he had let slide. And he wasn't turning back. By the time the Elysian Voyager reached its next port, a small but bustling harbor in Baja California, Graham's emergency team from corporate headquarters was already waiting on the pier. Clad in navy blazers and sharp determination, they boarded with clipboards, as tablets, and authority sharpened by his explicit orders. No tolerance, no cover-ups, no exceptions. The audits began within the hour. Departments were dissected. Shift rosters were reviewed against crew logs. Supply chain invoices were examined line by line. And Graham moved through it all, not above it, but inside it. He joined the meetings, answered hard questions, and corrected anyone who deflected blame. In the kitchen, Winston pulled him aside. "They're listening to me now," he said, still wary but cautiously optimistic. "I asked for replacement grills and 3 extra prep cooks. They said yes without arguing." Graham nodded. "Because now your voice is part of the chain of command, permanently." One by one, the cracks were sealed, but not just with patches. Graham had no interest in temporary fixes. He wanted structural change. He began with the tipping structure. For years, gratuities meant for service staff had been filtered through corporate cost recovery models, sliced and distributed unevenly. It was one of the most resented policies on board, but no one had dared raise it formally until now. Graham called an emergency finance session with his corporate leads. "Effective immediately," he said. "All guest gratuities will be redirected in full to the employees who earn them. Departmental distributions will be reviewed weekly. Any discrepancies, I want to see them myself." The room was silent for a beat. Then someone asked, "What about the general fund shortfall?" "Cut executive bonuses this quarter," Graham replied, without flinching. "Start with mine." Meanwhile, in the training center, he overhauled the onboarding process. New hires were no longer thrown into understaffed departments with vague instructions. Mia, whose insight had lit many of the first warning fires, was personally appointed to co-develop a new orientation system. Clear schedules, proper safety training, mentorship pairs. "I'm not a trainer," she protested at first. "You're not just a server either," Graham replied. "You saw the problems. You didn't flinch. That's leadership." She accepted, but not with words. Just a firm nod and a glance that said, "Don't screw this up." The transformation didn't stop there. Graham worked with HR to launch a protected feedback channel, a secure line between employees and corporate leadership that bypassed shipboard management. It would be monitored by a third-party ethics board, with anonymity guaranteed. For the first time in Elysian history, crew had a real voice and protection. Then came the surprise. Graham ordered the rerouting of supply chains. The food vendor responsible for providing expired or low-grade ingredients was cut from all contracts fleet-wide. Logistics teams were instructed to rebuild relationships with regional ethical suppliers, even if the cost per shipment increased. "We're not in the business of peddling deception," he told the procurement manager. "If we promise luxury, we deliver it." End of discussion. Later that evening, as he walked the decks in plain clothes again, not undercover but unguarded, he paused near the railing by the observation deck. The wind carried hints of grilled rosemary and clean linen. The air felt different, lighter. He turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. It was the older woman from the first day, the one who had stirred her watered-down cocktail in disgust and whispered that this was the worst cruise she'd ever taken. This time she smiled gently. "Mr. Carter?" He nodded. "Yes, I wanted to say thank you. My husband and I noticed things are different now. The staff seem more present, happier even." He smiled. "Still a work in progress. Aren't we all?" she said. Then her expression softened. "We were married on an ocean liner in 1979. What you're doing, it reminds me of that era, when ships had soul." She reached into her purse and handed him a small thank you card, handwritten. Graham accepted it quietly. As she walked away, he stood still for a long moment, the paper in his hands, the meaning deeper than he could put into words. Elsewhere, in the crew cafeteria, Dan Vargas watched the digital bulletin board flash new shift rotations. Balanced, fair, no back-to-back 16-hour runs. He chuckled to himself and said, "Hell must be freezing over." Jake received a surprise email confirming his promotion to assistant lead server, along with a personal message from Graham. You earned this, not just for how you work, but for how you never quit when it got hard. In the crew medical bay, Jonas rested under observation. He wasn't ready to return, but a senior executive from HQ had visited that morning with full insurance paperwork and a rehabilitation plan, including paid leave. No one had ever done that before. And then, in a moment Graham hadn't planned, Carmen from housekeeping requested a brief word with him during shift transition. I've seen changes come and go, she said cautiously. They sparkle, then they fade. But this, she hesitated. You're not just fixing systems, you're repairing people. Graham didn't reply with philosophy or strategy. He simply said, It's what I should have done years ago. Night fell over the Elysian Voyager as the ship sailed quietly toward its next port. The changes were still young. Skepticism still lingered in shadows, but something had shifted. For the first time in a long time, the ship had not just a captain, but a conscience. Dawn broke over the Pacific, casting pale gold across the deck of the Elysian Voyager. Graham stood alone at the bow, hands resting on the railing, the sea stretching out like a promise and a warning. Beneath his feet the ship was moving smoother, not just in function, but in rhythm. The chaos had quieted, not silenced, but redirected, toward rebuilding. He turned from the ocean and made his way below. Today, there were no meetings, no speeches, just presence. He started in the kitchen, where Winston was already barking orders over sizzling pans. But the tone had changed. Less frustration, more flow. Graham stepped into the prep area, and Winston nodded once, without stopping his work. Got fresh tomatoes today, he said, sliding a cutting board forward. Not frozen sludge, real stuff. Forgot how they smelled when they're not from a can. Next, Graham walked into the laundry hall where Teresa was back, still moving slow, her knee in a brace, but laughing with two younger crew members as she folded linens with one hand. She spotted him, raised an eyebrow, and said, You're early. Couldn't sleep. Good, she said. Now you know how we feel. But this time it wasn't bitter. It was shared. Midday, the Elysian Voyager reached the next port, Cabo San Lucas. The ship would remain docked overnight for guests to explore the town and restock supplies. As passengers disembarked, a new group of hires boarded, fresh crew, faces eager but uncertain. Mia met them at the orientation room, now outfitted with new safety signage, updated manuals, and a proper training video playing on a mounted screen. She wore a new badge, Staff Onboarding Supervisor. Graham watched quietly through the glass as she explained procedures with a calm but no-nonsense tone. The room listened. In the corner, a young technician, barely 20, raised his hand. What happens if we see something unsafe, but our supervisor tells us to ignore it? Mia didn't flinch. You report it anyway. We have a direct channel now. Nobody gets punished for protecting this ship or its people. Later that afternoon, Graham called a quiet meeting in a staff lounge near the lower deck. No managers. No board members. Just crew. A mix of veterans and newcomers. Housekeeping and kitchen, entertainment and maintenance. They filled every chair, sat on the floor, leaned against walls. He didn't stand at a podium. He didn't bring slides. He just talked. You've been told your job is to serve, he said. That's not wrong, but you should never be made to suffer in the process. This ship runs because of you, not because of Logos, not because of me. He looked around the room. There will be more changes. Not all of them will be perfect. Some may take longer than you want. But this isn't about fixing one ship. It's about rebuilding a culture, from the keel up. Dan Vargas raised a hand. What happens when the headlines fade? When corporate loses interest again? Graham didn't dodge. Then I've failed. But I won't, because this time it's not about policies, it's about ownership. He reached into a folder and pulled out a single sheet. Starting this quarter, Elysian Fleet International will begin its Employee Equity Pilot Program. Every full-time staff member on board this vessel is being granted shares. You won't just work on this ship, you'll own part of it. A beat of stunned silence. Then Mia from the back spoke. "Why now?" "Because I waited too long already," Graham replied. The mood in the room shifted. Not celebration, cautious belief. The kind that takes root when action finally matches intent. That night, the final dinner service of the cruise was held under the open sky. Music drifted from the upper deck. Servers moved without panic. Guests laughed. The air carried the scent of seared scallops, not frustration. Graham moved quietly among them. He stopped when he saw Jake, now in his new uniform, managing a small team of junior servers. "You settling in?" Graham asked. Jake turned, grinning, tie slightly crooked. "Still weird, but yeah, it feels different." "It should," Graham said. "You earned it." He didn't linger. Instead, he made his way to the aft deck, where the sun was dipping low behind the horizon. He wasn't alone. Teresa stood beside the railing, arms crossed, same position as their first meeting. She glanced sideways. "You're still here?" "Not leaving." She nodded. "I heard the share plan's real." "It is." She looked out at the water, her voice quiet. "It's not just the pay. It's feeling like someone noticed." "I did," Graham said. "Too late for some, but not for all." She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. She simply stayed beside him, two silhouettes against the last orange blaze of day. When the stars emerged and the ship eased back into open water, Graham remained on deck, coat open to the breeze. He had come on board looking for cracks. What he found was a broken mirror reflecting his own neglect. But now, piece by piece, it was being restored. Not for the image, for the people. And this time he would not look away again. In the quiet hum of an ocean vessel, one man remembered what leadership truly meant. Not control, not distance, but courage, humility, and accountability. The Elysian Voyager wasn't just fixed with policies. It was healed through listening, action, and the willingness to walk the lower decks. Because real change doesn't shout from the top, it rises from below. What does real leadership mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can all learn from each other's perspectives. And if stories like this move you, consider subscribing. It helps us keep creating meaningful content for people who believe in change.